Um, Welcome everybody. This is our first seminar of 2026, and I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and Dr. Aaron Adams for being our first presentation of the year. He's going to be sharing a review of last year's Bonefish survey, which a lot of you participated in, and discuss the latest survey on Florida Keys Tarpon. If you guys have any questions during the presentation, we have a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can pop any questions into there, and we'll try to get to them if we have time after the presentation. And if not, we can connect you with Dr. Adams afterwards. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started.
Great. Thanks, Jess. Thanks for having me here to give the presentation, first one of the year. Today I'm going to talk about what we call tracking the flats fisheries for better management. So first thing I want to do is kind of give you the background about the BTT approach, then talk some about what information is used for fisheries management, summarize the Bonefish survey that we did last year, and then talk about our plans, next steps for moving forward. So just said, yeah, if you have any questions, happy to answer them at the end, but also throw them into the chat as well, and we can work through them. All right, so first, work on background. So essentially, at BTT, we take a very habitat-focused approach, as many of you know, and so I'll call this information for conservation. So we focus a lot on habitat health. The pictures here on the upper left is a healthy seagrass bed, and on the lower right is that same seagrass bed after an extended algae bloom. And I know that some of you guys that fish in Florida Bay have had similar experiences to this. In addition to the seagrass, we also work a lot on water quality. They're integrated to a great extent. You have bad water quality, that's when you start to lose the seagrass. Nutrients is a big issue, which causes the algae blooms. And then we also look at the ecological impacts of those. So, for example, some of you are involved in the Bonefish and permanent prey study, looking at the amount and quality and diversity of prey in seagrass beds of different qualities. Water quality, obviously a big item, increasingly so. This picture is a red tide up in Southwest Florida. Pretty damn dramatic. But as many of you know, when the red tide up there gets strong enough and the winds are correct, it'll sweep all the way down through the Keys. And what was it, 2017, 2018, that wrapped all the way around to the east central east coast of Florida. So yeah, water quality can be a huge issue for us. The Everglades, obviously restoration is a big one that we're working on. But also even things like shallow injection wells for wastewater treatment in some of the locations in the middle and lower Keys are problematic as well, but at least some of those are getting fixed. A big one, of course, especially in the last 15 years or so, is boat traffic. The picture on the left is a flat in the lower Keys showing what the state FWC terms moderate and severe propeller scarring. If you took a picture of this flat, say 30 years ago, it was entirely seagrass. So you can have propeller scars, and then over time, they can actually kind of erode a bit more and expand and create just large areas of open bottom. And then, of course, the water, I don't know what much you want to call them, the things that we call jet skis that are kind of the bane of the existence of the flats fishery. And so many of you have been involved in putting together plans for the state and the sanctuary about creating pole troll and idle speed zones to address some of these boat traffic issues. And we continue to work on those. Work a lot on either studying or having education on catch and release mortality. I know a number of you took part in the Save the Slime, putting the information together for Bonefish, for better handling and photography and releasing the fish. FWC did a study on Tarpon post-release mortality about, 10, 12 years ago. And that resulted in the current regulations for you can't take a fish out more than 40 inches out of the water because it greatly increases the mortality. One of the challenges that we have, though, is that there are a lot of new people coming into the fishery and they don't have this knowledge. So it's something that we have to continue. And I know you guys do a lot as well. We also have to be concerned a lot about harvest in other areas. The top picture gives a brief overview of what we found out with a lot of that acoustic tracking. Essentially, we have three subpopulations of tarpon. We have an East Coast population, an Eastern Gulf of Mexico subpopulation, and a Western Gulf of Mexico subpopulation. And this is based on a lot of that acoustic telemetry that work that Luke Griffin did with Jake Brownscombe as well. So essentially, you have the the Atlantic coast of the U.S. and the Eastern Gulf. Those subpopulations mix in the Florida Keys, where you guys interact with them, especially during the spring into the summer. And then they typically do their migratory patterns. There are some fish that kind of cross over, but it's very small number. And then the same kind of thing happens with the Eastern and Western Gulf subpopulations, and their mixing zone is up in the Mississippi Delta during the summer. So far, we don't have a fish that's crossed that boundary, that's gone from the Eastern Gulf to the Western Gulf and completed that other migration. And then in Central America, we seem to have much smaller movement patterns. So there's not fish going between the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, the Florida area, on rare occasion, but very, very rare. However, they're still connected to our population because when they spawn, those larvae are in the open ocean for 2 to 4 weeks. That's plenty of time to ride the loop current up into this area as well, which is one of the reasons we continue working down there, of course, and trying to expand a bit. All right, so now with that, the type of work that we focus on a lot and work with you guys on a lot of the projects, kind of have to pivot here and talk about standard fisheries management, the type of information that they've been using to manage fisheries for the past, I would say, 140 years. And that's basically a stock assessment method, mathematical modeling. And what that needs is what I term bodies on the dock. They need fish in hand to get length measurements, weight measurements, extract the otoliths the ear bones or otoliths so they can estimate the age. That way they can get a population structure, young fish, old fish. They can get a composition of what's being caught as far as fish size and age. And they can figure out growth rates. And they use that to calculate their stock assessment. And then they can figure out what's harvested. And this is what's been used for commercial fisheries. It allows them to track fisheries over time because I'll repeat this every, say, 5 to 7 years. The problem is, or the challenge is that it's extremely data intensive. So most fisheries management agencies don't have enough funds or personnel in order to get these types of data. So even in Florida, for example, most of their stock assessment effort goes into commercially valuable species like grouper and snapper, with some effort as well in snook, redfish, and spotted sea trout. To most other species to a much lesser extent. And then for bonefish, tarpon, and permit, they've never done a stock assessment. And to be quite honest with you, it's never going to happen. They're just not going to put the resources into that. When we kind of broaden out to the other areas we work, Bahamas, Cuba, Belize, Mexico, they don't have the resources either. So that's really not going to happen. So one of the things that we have to do is figure out how to provide data that these agencies are more familiar with using and combine that with the type of conservation information that I just talked about. To give you an idea of what the types of graphs I come up with for stock assessments, this one shows what they call the spawning stock biomass. Basically, how many fish are out there of spawning age, whether it's good or bad, above a certain threshold. That threshold they set here for redfish, you can see on the horizontal line. And this is a regional one by NOAA. You can see it was doing well for a bit, but for the past 15 years or so, it's been declining and is now below that threshold. Another way they look at that is commercial and recreational data. Again, this is throughout the region. The blue line is the commercial, and the green is recreational catch and release, and the light, and then The darker green is harvest. So these type of information they get is say bodies on the dock. All right, so we have to come up with a way to provide the information in conjunction with our conservation data that we can use to inform and guide the fisheries management agencies. So we can figure out a new way to manage our fisheries a bit more proactively than reactively. So I'll call this information for fisheries management. That's what we'll talk about for the rest of the presentation. So we basically have to speak the language of the managers, the stock assessment people. And this is how they were trained. This is what they've been doing in their own careers for decades. So information they're in structure that they're familiar with is really important. We also need something that addresses change over time or track the trends, fishery now versus 5, 10, 50 years ago, and then continue to be able to track that over time is important. We also have to structure it so it links back to that conservation data that I told you about. So if we see, for example, that there have been declines in the types and abundance of prey for bonefish, and that coincides with a decline in the bonefish population or a slowing of the growth rate, that gives us double the amount of leverage to actually force more changes in both conservation, things like water quality management, but also other regulations. Some of this type of information was important back in, I want to say 2011, 2012 timeframe, when, and my memory may be failing me, when it was no longer allowed to put bonefish in live wells to transport for tournaments because it was increasing mortality. It also has to be reliable and repeatable, so it's not just a one-off. And then I'm going to focus on this a lot moving forward. We have to be able to quantify expert information, and you guys are by far the experts. It would go back to the 2000s, and the opinions of your colleagues, and in some cases predecessors, were super important when we got our first regulation changes with permit. We didn't have the data, but it was the opinions of and experiences of the guides in the Keys about a decline in the permit fishery in the 2000s that was enabled us to work with FWC to, first of all, create this special permit zone, which is the Florida Keys, with much more strict regulations there, but also to split pompano and permit. Prior to then, pompano and permit were managed as the same fishery. So we were able to force them to split that. Since that time, though, the standard, the bar we have to reach in order to influence regulation and conservation change has definitely been raised a good bit. And so we have to quantify the information. Opinion is important, but it's not enough. So to give you an idea of how we might present this or how we are presenting this to the fishery management agencies, this graph shows the solid line is the type of data that I just showed you. They'll use to do a stock assessment. This is for lingcod. And then the types of survey that we did for bonefish, and we'll talk about some more the rest of the presentation, is the dashed line. And you can see they track very well. So when the stock assessment guys with the fisheries agencies see these types of similarities, they're more likely to start to trust the data. We trust the data, but we're kind of breaking through a paradigm that's been in operation for, as I said, about 140 years. All right, so section 2, I'm going to briefly summarize the Bonefish survey that Ben Jones at Project Seagrass and Jen Rahage at FIU and others completed. Presented to you guys, some of you, if you attended the meeting last year, but I want to run through it again so everyone's familiar. And to remind everyone what happened. So basically, as I said, going from qualitative to quantitative is important. That's a picture of Gordy Hill that I'm sure many of you know. By far the one with the most years of experience in the survey. So what's happened in the past is it's been more of asking qualitative questions. So it's the type of thing that you might be sitting around having a beer or two after a day of fishing, talking about how the fishing is not as good as it was, or improving. Fish are larger or smaller. Those are kind of relative general terms that don't do much as far as putting them into management. But a lot of sociological research has shown that our brains are inherently quantitative if we know how to ask the right questions. And so a lot of these types of approaches have been used for many, many years in medical field. So a lot of the different procedures and whatnot you might experience when you go into a hospital, those whole structures have been based on these types of surveys that have been able to get quantitative information to measure results. So what we're doing with this new survey technique for fisheries is asking for data in a way that kind of triggers those quantitative memories of our brains. So the survey questions we asked for the Bonefish survey were asked for in the past, what was the best year in terms of shots you had at fish, both in year and then estimated number, your best catch, the most fish, and then of course weight, the largest fish. Now, if you're like me, somebody can't ask you they can't ask me these questions and I come up with the answer right away. But if they ask these questions and I take some time to kind of ponder it, think about it, yeah, it's pretty accurate. I remember kind of running through this with Chico Fernandez a number of years ago. And I mean, he's got a great memory, but he can still remember not just the year, but the month and I think even the week that he caught his first double-digit bonefish on fly. So that type of information can be super useful. And if we get it from a broad range of experience, that gives us some pretty good estimates. And then that's compared to the best and the average for, in this case, it was 2024. If we ask it now, it would be for 2025, the most recent year, of those same metrics. And comparing those now versus in the past gives us some pretty good estimates. And I'll show you here some graphs that are very much like the stock assessment graph I just showed you. And then, of course, we have to standardize it because people fish different amounts of time during a day on average, not every single day. And so we'll ask also things about how many hours are fished in a day so we can standardize that for people who fish, say, 4 versus 8 hours in a day. So that gave us the ability to look at a 60-year trend in best shots in this case. So 5 regions: Lower Keys, Middle Keys, Upper Keys, Biscayne Bay, Florida Bay. We had 69 guides and 92 anglers, which was a great response. The age was 16 to 95. Experience 1 to 70 years. And we all know who the 95-year-old, now 96, and 70 years experience is. But pretty impressive that it's over 4,000 years of fishing experience combined. So the information that we're able to graph looks like this. Number of shots per day. You can see year on the bottom. That line is the estimate, and then the range of air around the estimate is in the shaded. So for those of us who've been fishing in the Keys for long enough that experience that kind of peak and then decline, and especially in the mid 90s, continuing through the cold kill in 2010. Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. If we look at this, it peaked in the early 90s. The rapid decline started in the mid 90s all the way through 2005, and then 2010, of course, was pretty massive with that cold kill as well. But as many of you guys have experienced, it's increasing again, which is fantastic. And being able to track that over time provides great information because we're able to, again, correlate that with some of the other metrics that we're measuring. Some are saying it's increasing and some are decreasing. That's part of the air. So the great thing is we repeat this in 5 to 7 years. It will be super interesting to see if things have kind of come together more or spread out more, which might mean that there's some regional differences. And having looked at some of the data, a lot of this increasing versus decreasing is due to regional differences, which is super interesting because the decline that started in the 90s through the 2000s was also super regional. If we look at best weight, again, a kind of a similar graph. It's interesting to note that the largest size consistently for best weight, the years were mid to late 90s. This kind of was delayed from the population decline, and we see that a decent amount. And because there were fewer and fewer larvae, juveniles, and smaller fish coming into the population got dominated by those older, larger fish. And it's going to take some time for that population demographic, that population structure to kind of return for those larger fish to come back into the population. Because realize, bonefish, we've aged them at well over 20 years. And so having those fish get to that age, it just inside it's just going to take a while. So again, weight is very far below the median over that entire time period, and it's been decreasing, as I said, since the late 90s. And so hopefully, as we keep seeing small fish, we're going to build that population more and more. And in the 10, 15, 20-year time frame, hopefully start to see some of those larger weight fish. And we'll keep track of that for sure. So once you get new data, you need to kind of compare it to other databases. And so they did a great job. The team did a great job of looking at tournament records. So the Islamorada fall all tackle. On the right there, you see how the top is weight, at the bottom is catch per unit effort. The black line is the survey that I just summarized, and the blue line is the tournament data. And you can see they track really well, which gives us confidence that the data are solid. The other thing that the team did is they went back and they surveyed guides. They showed them the data and they said, okay, how accurate do you think it is? And that the numbers went from 80% and up. If we show the stock assessment scientists with the fisheries management agency that these estimates are 85, 90% accurate, they'd be ecstatic. Because there's a lot of error in their standard stock assessments. All right, so now the thing is, what's next? The survey wasn't just a one-off. It was a first of what we intend to have as a plan. So I'm now kind of run through the long-term plan for this type of approach. So, as I said, we need to establish a repeatable assessment that speaks the language of the fisheries managers. So, we're going to repeat the survey that I just described every 5 to 7 years. We want to do it for bonefish, tarpon, as well as permit. Probably offset those years so the surveys aren't all occurring in the same year. At the same time, that same time frame, we want to repeat the flats economic study. The last one we did was more than 15 years ago. We need to make that more frequent because that study allows us to throw economic and social and cultural data into the mix of assessment of the fishery, right? Because it's not just about the number of fish you might think are out there. It's also about the quality of the fishery and the community that it supports. We'll also collect fish length information, which gives us the age so that we can keep a track of the population structure of the fishery, make sure that we're not getting dominated by just large fish, for example, which would tell us that we're not getting small fish and be an alarm bell for sure. As I've already said, we can combine this with conservation projects. The prey study is a good example. Keeping track of bonefish spawning aggregations is another one. It's interesting when we started looking for bonefish spawning aggregations in the Keys in the 2000s, we couldn't find them. It's probably because there weren't enough spawning aged fish to create an aggregation. But now we certainly have them, and Ross has been documenting those with you guys for a number of years. And then once we have this established in the Keys, we intend to expand it to the region, Bahamas, Belize, Mexico, Cuba. Many levels of research that we've done show the connectivity, the intensive connectivity for bonefish, especially between the Caribbean and the Florida Keys. So making sure we keep track of those fisheries is also very important. So we can, again, be more proactive rather than reactive as we've had to be in the past. So now I'm going to kind of wrap it all up with talking about the Tarpon survey. That's our next step. The bonefish survey was super successful. So right now, conducting the Tarpon survey, and we need the participation as much as possible. So a few things are a little bit different about the Tarpon survey. One is the main metrics. It's not asking for number of shots, because you can have tons of shot every day. Well, I won't go into all that. You guys know. So instead, after talking to a bunch of different anglers and guides, thinking about it a lot, having conversations, the main metrics are the number of eats or hookups, rather than number of shots. Largest fish, so those are still, again, largest fish. Those are our main metrics. And these don't have to be caught fish. You guys are all excellent and experts out there. You see a fish, get a couple jumps, you can tell, you can get a pretty good idea of the size of that fish. And so that's reliable information. So that's the type of information that for the survey has to differ a little bit depending on the species that we're focusing on. So bonefish questions will be slightly different than tarpon, will be slightly different than permit, but it all goes into the same approach in the output. So far, we've had a pretty good angler response, which is 68, which is fantastic, but we're way behind on the guide response, only 16. So part of the reason to do this webinar is to run you guys through the reason for why we're doing the survey and try and get more participation. And you can scan that QR code, that'll take you straight to the survey. If you're like the way my mind works, need some time to think about it, go ahead through and answer the survey questions as a best guess, and then don't complete the survey. Don't click complete at the end. It'll be a non-finished survey, which we won't include. Think about the questions, then you can come back and complete the survey after you've thought about it a bit. But it's super important that we all take part in these surveys. And I know you guys can get survey fatigue because the Keys has become a pretty popular spot for people from all walks of academic life to do surveys. And in some respects, that's a great sign. It shows that you guys and BTT and others are doing a good job of leading the kind of conservation efforts for the marine world. So kind of to wrap it all up as far as so we do surveys. So what? Compared to 25 years ago, 25 years ago when I started with BTT, the fishing community is a hell of a lot more influential in management, which is a huge and positive change. And that's been based on knowledge and data. But as I said, what was once okay from informed opinions, well, that's kind of icing on the cake. The data that comes from those opinions by doing things like the survey that allows us to quantify it in the correct terms is becoming essential. And so this is a chance to actually increase our influence, continue to increase it, and also to kind of provide the proof of concept for the rest of Florida as well as the region. Some of you guys, if you were at at the symposium in November and saw the guide panel or participated in the guide panel, there are guide organizations from around the state of Florida. Homosassa was there, Boca Grande was there, as well as Belize, Bahamas, in the region. And they're looking in many ways to the Florida Keys for a lead, and they're following that lead. So, for example, in Homosassa, they're working on a plan for pole troll idle speed zones to protect the seagrass and the tarpon fishery. So continuing that influence, the more people that do it, the more influence we have. I've mentioned this before, and I keep going back to it because it's hugely important. Being able to connect these types of data, this information, to the conservation research findings that we have is extremely powerful. It's one thing to argue about numbers of fish declining or increasing, but when we can tie that to ecological issues that are going on, it's extremely, extremely influential. And so, basically, it's an investment. The thing that I've learned over my career is there's nobody else that's really outside of our fishery that is really focused on making sure that the fishery stays healthy over time. And so we're basically it. So we're the ones who have to get the information and then work together to apply that information. Because if we don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. So with that, I'll wrap up and take any questions people have.